On the night before Thanksgiving, November 24th, 1971, a man boarded a short flight from Portland to Seattle using the name Dan Cooper. He wore a business suit, ordered a bourbon and 7-Up, and quietly passed a note to one of the flight attendants. The note read, "I have a bomb in my briefcase." Over the next few hours, the man demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. Then, somewhere over the forests of southwestern Washington, he opened the aircraft's rear stairs and jumped into the darkness. He was never seen again, and more than 50 years later, no one knows who he really was. This is the story of D.B. Cooper, the only unsolved skyjacking in American history. Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 left Portland at 2:50 p.m. It was a short flight, only about 30 minutes in the air before landing in Seattle. There were 36 passengers on board, most of them expecting a routine trip across the Pacific Northwest. The man had purchased his ticket under the name Dan Cooper, although history would later remember him as D.B. Cooper. He sat quietly in the last row, seat 18E. Witnesses later describe him as being in his mid-40s, around 6 feet tall, or about 183 centimeters, wearing a dark suit and wraparound glasses. Nothing about him seemed unusual. He looked like a businessman traveling between cities. After the plane reached cruising altitude, Cooper ordered a drink, a bourbon and 7-Up. He sat calmly, smoking a cigarette. At the time, smoking was still permitted on commercial flights. He looked out the window as the aircraft climbed north toward Seattle. A few minutes later, he handed a folded note to a flight attendant named Florence Schaffner. At first, she assumed it was a lonely businessman's phone number, and without reading it, she placed the note in her purse. Cooper leaned slightly toward her and whispered, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Schaffner sat beside him as Cooper calmly explained the situation. He opened his briefcase slightly so she could see inside. Inside were 8 red cylinders connected by wires and attached to a large cylindrical battery, which she assumed were sticks of dynamite. Whether it was a real bomb or not, she had no reason to doubt him. Cooper closed the briefcase and told Schaffner his demands. Schaffner wrote a note with Cooper's demands, brought it to the cockpit, and informed the flight crew of the situation. Captain William Scott directed Schaffner to remain in the cockpit for the remainder of the flight and take notes of events as they happened. He then relayed the hijacker's demands to Northwest Flight Operations in Minnesota. Requests $200,000 in a knapsack by 5 p.m. He wants 2 front parachutes, 2 back parachutes. He wants the money in negotiable American currency. By requesting 4 parachutes, authorities later realized it was a clever move. If Cooper had only asked for 1 parachute, they might have given him a defective one. By demanding 4, he created the possibility that he might force a passenger or crew member to jump with him. That meant the parachutes had to be fully functional. With Schaffner in the cockpit, flight attendant Tena Bar sat beside Cooper to relay messages between him and the flight crew. Cooper made additional demands through Mucklow. Upon landing at Seattle-Tacoma Airport, fuel trucks were to refuel the plane, and all passengers were to remain seated while Mucklow brought the money on board. Because everything happened quietly between Cooper and the flight crew, the passengers had no idea the plane had been hijacked. They were simply told the delay was caused by a minor mechanical problem. For nearly 2 hours, Flight 305 circled the dark waters of Puget Sound, while police and FBI agents rushed to gather the ransom money and locate parachutes to meet Cooper's demands. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere remained strangely calm. The hijacker never appeared nervous. While the aircraft continued circling Seattle, Mucklow chatted with Cooper and asked why he chose Northwest Airlines to hijack. Cooper replied, "It's not because I have a grudge against your airlines. It's just because I have a grudge." Around 5:46 p.m., Flight 305 landed at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. The aircraft was directed to a remote section of the runway, away from the terminal. Police, FBI agents, and airport personnel watched from a distance as the situation unfolded. Following Cooper's instructions, a single airline employee approached the aircraft carrying the ransom money and the parachutes. 2 parachutes came from a local skydiving school, and the other 2 were provided by a local stunt pilot. Inside the cabin, the passengers remained seated, while the bag of cash was brought aboard. The ransom consisted of 10,000 unmarked $20 bills, weighing nearly 20 pounds, or about 8.5 kilograms. Then, just as he had promised, he allowed the passengers to leave. One by one, the 36 passengers disembarked from the plane, still unaware of how the situation would end. The 2 flight attendants who had been assisting earlier also left the aircraft. When the cabin door finally closed, only 5 people remained on board: the hijacker, flight attendant Tena Bar, and 3 members of the flight crew. After he received the money and the parachutes, he instructed the pilots to take off again and fly south toward Mexico City. He gave them specific conditions for the flight. The aircraft had to stay below 10,000 feet, fly at a slow speed, keep the landing gear partially deployed, and keep the cabin unpressurized. The crew explained that the plane could not reach Mexico on a single tank of fuel under those conditions. After a brief discussion, they agreed to stop in Reno, Nevada for refueling. At 7:40 p.m., the Boeing 727 took off once again into the night sky. Unbeknownst to him, several military aircraft had already been scrambled to follow the hijacked plane. 2 F-106 fighter jets and a T-33 trainer trailed the aircraft from a distance, flying in patterns designed to stay hidden from Cooper's view. Inside the cabin, Cooper ordered Tena Bar to remain with him while the plane continued climbing. A few minutes later, he gave her one final instruction: go to the cockpit, close the curtain separating the coach and first-class sections, and not return. Bar begged Cooper to take the bomb with him, and he agreed. She would be the last person to ever see him. Around 8 p.m., a cockpit warning light flashed, indicating that the rear air stair had been deployed. At approximately 8:13 p.m., the aircraft's tail suddenly pitched upward, forcing the pilots to adjust the controls and return the plane to level flight. Moments later, cold air rushed into the cabin as the pressure inside the aircraft changed. Somewhere over the northern suburbs of Portland, the hijacker descended the rear stairs of the Boeing 727 and jumped into the darkness, carrying the ransom money with him. But the fighter pilots trailing the aircraft never saw him jump. The crew continued flying toward Reno, unsure whether Cooper was still somewhere on board. From the cockpit, they tried to contact him through the intercom and asked him to raise the air stairs so the plane could land safely. But there was no response. At 11:02 p.m., the aircraft finally landed at Reno Tahoe International Airport, with the rear staircase still hanging open. Police and FBI agents surrounded the plane, preparing for the possibility that Cooper and the bomb might still be inside. But at that moment, Cooper was no longer aboard. The disappearance triggered one of the most extensive manhunts in FBI history. The investigation was given the codename NORJAK, short for Northwest Hijacking. Agents immediately began searching the area where Cooper was believed to have jumped, a vast stretch of rugged wilderness across southwestern Washington. Hundreds of soldiers, FBI agents, and volunteers combed through the forests, rivers, and mountain terrain. Helicopters scanned the landscape from the air, while ground teams searched for any sign of a parachute, the ransom money, or a body. 12 days after the hijacking, the U.S. Air Force deployed an SR-71 Blackbird, the fastest aircraft ever built, to retrace Flight 305's route and photograph the landscape below. The aircraft flew 5 reconnaissance missions along the flight path, but poor visibility made the images useless. At the same time, investigators tried to determine exactly where Cooper had jumped. Using another Boeing 727, FBI agents recreated the flight conditions and pushed a 200-pound sled out of the aircraft's rear staircase. The test reproduced the same sudden motion the pilots had felt at 8:13 p.m., confirming that Cooper likely jumped at that moment. Based on the flight data, investigators narrowed the possible landing zone to a remote region near Mount St. Helens, close to Lake Merwin in southwestern Washington. Search teams expanded their efforts across Clark and Cowlitz counties. FBI agents, sheriff's deputies, soldiers from Fort Lewis, and hundreds of volunteers searched forests and riverbanks on foot, while helicopters scanned the terrain from the air. Patrol boats and even a submarine were used to examine the depths of Lake Merwin. Despite the massive effort, nothing connected to Cooper was ever found. Investigators then turned their attention to the aircraft itself, hoping the hijacker had left behind some trace of his identity. On one of the seats, they discovered a black clip-on tie with a mother-of-pearl tie clip. Agents also recovered 66 unidentified fingerprints from surfaces inside the cabin. Another potential clue came from Cooper's behavior during the flight. He had been chain-smoking Raleigh cigarettes, leaving several cigarette butts in the ashtray. Those cigarette butts could have provided valuable DNA evidence. However, when investigators later attempted to extract DNA, they discovered the cigarette butts had already been destroyed. The parachutes delivered to the aircraft also raised new questions. Among the 4 parachutes provided was a reserve training parachute borrowed from a local skydiving school. Unlike a real parachute, it had been sewn shut for classroom demonstrations and could not actually deploy. The parachutes had been gathered quickly from several sources around Seattle, and in the urgency of the situation, none of them were properly inspected before being handed over. After the plane landed in Reno, investigators realized Cooper had taken the dummy chute. At first, this suggested he may not have been an experienced skydiver. However, some researchers later proposed another possibility. Cooper may have recognized that the parachute was non-functional and cut the canopy from the pack, using the empty container to secure the ransom money to his body before jumping. But one of the most intriguing clues came from the tie Cooper removed during the flight. For decades, it remained one of the few pieces of physical evidence in the case. In 2009, a group of researchers re-examined the tie using an electron microscope. They discovered tens of thousands of microscopic metal particles embedded in the fabric, including traces of titanium and other rare industrial materials. At the time of the hijacking, some of these metals were commonly used in specialized aerospace manufacturing. Researchers later linked the particles to materials associated with Remcrew Titanium, a company near Pittsburgh that produced advanced alloys in the 1950s and the 1960s. If the analysis is correct, it suggests that Cooper may have worked in an industrial or engineering environment, possibly connected to the aerospace industry. Another strange detail involved the name he used. The hijacker never actually called himself D.B. Cooper. The airline ticket he purchased was under the name Dan Cooper. The name D.B. Cooper appeared only because of a mistake by a reporter during the early news coverage. The incorrect name quickly spread through newspapers and television and eventually became the name remembered by history. For years, investigators believed the alias was simply random. At the time, passengers could buy airline tickets with cash without showing identification, making it easy to travel under a false name. But later, researchers discovered another clue. In Europe, there was a Belgian comic book series published in French about a fictional Royal Canadian Air Force pilot named Dan Cooper. The character was known for flying advanced aircraft and skydiving missions. The comic had been widely published in French-speaking Europe and Canada, but it was never translated into English or distributed in the United States. This raised an intriguing possibility that the real Cooper may have been a French-speaking Canadian, or an American who had spent time stationed overseas. Even the wording of his ransom demand hinted at this. He specifically requested negotiable American currency. For someone already inside the United States, the phrase was slightly unusual, as most people would simply ask for dollars. Then there was the mystery of the money found at Tena Bar. In 1980, nearly 9 years after the hijacking, 8-year-old Brian Ingram was digging in the sand along the Columbia River when he uncovered several decaying bundles of $20 bills. Before handing the money over to Cooper, the FBI secretly recorded the serial numbers of all 10,000 $20 bills. So, when the money was brought to the FBI, the serial numbers matched the ransom money given to Cooper. For decades, investigators believed Cooper had died during the jump and the cash had simply washed downstream. But in 2020, scientists conducted a new analysis of the bills. Scientists later discovered microscopic algae called diatoms attached to the bills. The species found on the money typically bloom in spring. That suggested the bills had not been submerged in the winter of November 1971 when Cooper jumped. Instead, they may have entered the water months later. Even today, no one can fully explain how the money arrived there. On the night of the hijacking, Cooper jumped into darkness over the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. The weather was cold, with strong winds and heavy rain. He was wearing loafers, a trench coat, and a business suit, hardly the kind of clothing used for skydiving. The parachute he took was also a military-style canopy, which was difficult to steer. If he drifted into dense forest or rugged terrain, landing safely would have been extremely difficult. For these reasons, the FBI long leaned toward the theory that Cooper likely did not survive the jump. But later events complicated that theory. The Cooper hijacking inspired a wave of copycat skyjackings across the United States. In the months that followed, several criminals attempted similar escapes by parachuting from aircraft. In 1972 alone, 5 different hijackers carried out jumps inspired by the Cooper case. One of them, Martin McNally, jumped from a commercial aircraft traveling at more than 320 knots, far faster than Cooper's plane. Another, Richard LaPointe, parachuted into the Colorado mountains in the middle of winter while wearing cowboy boots. Despite the dangerous conditions, all 5 survived their jumps, which only deepens the mystery. If Cooper had the right experience and landed in the right place, he might have walked away into the darkness. After decades of investigation, the FBI examined hundreds of possible suspects. Some of the names included Special Forces veteran Ted Braden, Dwayne Weber, whose wife claimed he confessed on his deathbed, former paratrooper William Gossett, who repeatedly insisted that he was the real Cooper, aerospace engineer Vince Peterson, and even skydiver Barbara Dayton, who once claimed she carried out the hijacking disguised as a man. But none of these theories were ever supported by convincing evidence. None of the suspects were ever charged. Among the many theories, however, a few names continue to stand out. Among the more unusual candidates was Robert Rackstraw, a Vietnam War veteran and trained pilot. Rackstraw had a long criminal history involving fraud and explosives, and at one point he even faked his own death to avoid prosecution. Some investigators believed his military background and parachuting experience matched the profile of the hijacker. Rackstraw himself seemed to enjoy the speculation. When asked about the case, he once replied, "I wouldn't discount myself." Supporters of the theory claim that coded letters were sent to newspapers in the years after the hijacking may contain hidden references to Rackstraw's name and military units. Another widely discussed suspect is Kenneth Christiansen. Christiansen had once worked for Northwest Orient Airlines, the same airline involved in the hijacking. He was also a former paratrooper and was familiar with the Boeing 727. Christiansen smoked and displayed a fondness for bourbon, the same drink Cooper had requested. In the years after the crime, he unexpectedly purchased a house in Bonnie Lake, Washington, despite having a modest income. Some believe this was a hint that he was Cooper. However, the FBI remained skeptical because Christiansen did not match the physical description of the hijacker, and there was no direct evidence connecting him to the crime. Then there is Sheridan Peterson, a Boeing employee and experienced smoke jumper, a type of firefighter trained to parachute into remote forests. Peterson was familiar with the Boeing 727 aircraft. He also physically resembled the sketches created by investigators. However, Peterson always denied being involved in the hijacking. Despite decades of speculation, none of these suspects has ever been definitely linked to the crime. However, one name continues to attract particular attention. McCoy was a Vietnam War veteran and an experienced helicopter pilot who committed a remarkably similar skyjacking in 1972, just 5 months after the Cooper hijacking. Using a Boeing 727, McCoy demanded $500,000 in ransom and later parachuted from the aircraft. Unlike Cooper, he was eventually caught. After being sentenced to prison, McCoy escaped using a fake gun made from dental paste before being killed in a shootout with FBI agents in 1974. For decades, investigators debated whether McCoy might have been the real D.B. Cooper. The FBI ultimately rejected the theory, citing differences in physical appearance reported by flight attendants and inconsistencies in the timeline. McCoy also had no known connection to French-speaking Canada or Europe that might explain the alias, Dan Cooper. However, in the years that followed the hijacking, the aviation industry quietly changed. D.B. Cooper's escape exposed a weakness in the design of the Boeing 727. The aircraft's rear staircase could be lowered during flight, something that had never previously been considered a serious security risk. After the Cooper hijacking and several copycat attempts, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered a permanent fix. Engineers installed a small device on the exterior of the aircraft known as the Cooper vane. It worked as a simple aerodynamic lock. Once the aircraft gained speed, airflow forced the device into place, physically preventing the rear stairs from being lowered. From that point forward, the escape method Cooper used would no longer be possible. Yet the mystery itself was never solved. Despite one of the largest manhunts in FBI history, more than 50 years later, the identity of the man who called himself Dan Cooper remains unknown. Somewhere in the night sky of 1971, a man stepped out of an airplane with $200,000 and disappeared into history.